We are running, we should be running. Evening all, we have the Thomas Blug Summer of Love Stratocaster. Well, it's a V6 Vintage Signature Series V6, and it's yeah, you know, it's a kind of folks distressed, relict, heavily saffroned, rusted, deliberately missing a single screw there in the bridge, and yeah, it's a particular type of guitar, and it's well liked and respected. The pickups are very stratty and good fun, and it's yeah, it's got a slightly an interesting sort of feel through to the raw wood, and some blemishes that you can see that you don't quite know how or why they're blemished given the production approach. That's sticking up proud. That's a kind of that's a sticking up bit. That's an in bit. That's cut away to the finish. But I have a feeling that this stuff here is some sort of wrap. Again, it's like a photograph picture. And one of the reasons what tells me that is when you look at it, it has a fairly familiar kind of print bleed around it. You see that? The blues and the reds. It's not lining up. So that's some sort of sticker. And I think the sunburst is also a print as well. I don't think it's painted in the conventional sense, although I wonder if the cream bit may be painted, and this feels slightly raised. This doesn't, by comparison. That feels like it's gone through to the wood. But here's something that's quite telling. Oh look, damage has gone through to the wood, but miraculously the graphic has been laid over the top of it. Dun dun dun. Now, how would you do that? Unless that was some kind of printout. See what I mean? It's a transparency that's been laid over this, and you can see the bleed of the colours is not good. So that's a printing offset error. So the whole of this is really weird. But anyway, it doesn't change the fact that overall these are fun guitars to play. And this one's a sort of upside down, so for a right-hander it has a kind of bit of a Hendrix feel to it. The necks on these, I've always liked them. They're good fun to play. This is an odd radius. It claims to be 7.5 somewhere in the paperworks, but actually it isn't quite 7.5. Sorry, it's actually more between 9.5 and 7.25, and I don't actually seeing it being quite 7.5. In fact, when you put the guide on it, it drops off, so it looks like 7.25 in the middle, but it drops off the edges. Now, it wouldn't do that if it was 7.5, if you see what I mean. So you would expect a 7.5 to be there'd be less of a gap. But anyway, so it's a kind of a bit of an odd radius compared to my steel radius guides. That's what I'm trying to get across. There's that thing there. Anyway, so I'm going to set this up, and this is for Rob, and hopefully this is for Rob and his son, Sam. And so this is going to be set up to play really nice and low. It's at the moment way high, and it's all over the place. Now it came without a tremolo arm, and I found a suitably aged Wilkinson push-in arm that will do the business, except this arm is used to being kind of held in snugly by the hex key. I haven't been able to access that yet. So I started looking at this bridge yesterday, and the first thing I noticed about this bridge that's going to be a bit of a problem is right in there, that one is completely screwed. So you can't get that one out at all. So I'm going to have to, first of all, take the strings off, or I've slackened them off already, but I'm going to take the strings off. Oh, there's another thing about this that the Relic people will probably agree with me on. That's what they've done to make the pickups look yellow. They've painted it, hand painted it, with some yellowy stuff. Now, at a distance it looks fine, but up close it looks, I mean, is that, I hope that's dust and not beard shavings from the person in the factory. Anyway, you know, up close it does look pretty naive and ropey, but at a distance it ain't bad and it's fun to play. So I let them off a little bit, but you know, you can see the sort of saffron dye and stuff is, or whatever, amber dye is just a bit overused, painted on and left to dry. And then, you know, you have the rust here, which is okay, except when you get to one of these, like there, you go, I hope that isn't completely crapped up, because you do need to be able to use these things. And that must be one of the challenges, is to relic it in that way with rust and then retain functionality, because it would be really annoying if if they weren't functional. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by, obviously this is a different order of events to how I would normally do it. So I'm going to start by removing the springs, and I'm going to remove as much as I can. I'm going to remove these things. Now, the reason these get stuffed is because you can't really get to them very well, because of the way the claw is designed and the way the angle that they sit in. They almost always end up screwing up, and that's pretty naffed. So we're going to sort of take that out and ideally bin both of these if they're just going to be a problem. And we'll put some fresh ones in just to restart with some decent stuff that we can actually grip and adjust. And I've got a couple of ones here, and they're not quite as heavy as these, but they're fresh and they should grip all right. Yeah, the whole business with the claw is funny, because it's so badly designed that you can never truly get clean purchase on these here. Look at this, even this doesn't want to fit. You can't get a clean purchase. Could this be part of the problem, that the hole doesn't feel quite in the right place? Yeah, you can't ever get a clean grab onto these screws because of the way the claw gets in the way. And so you sort of almost bound to end up scrubbing the screwdriver head fitment, whatever that bit's called. The only way you can sort of get around it is if you make sure that the angle that the screws go in is a bit more elevated. But then again, that only really works if you don't end up running out of space in the cavity. That should be about okay. And so obviously those will last. They'll stay working until such time in the future as they get scuffed up again. So I'm going to put these back in, and I'll put them in straight. I had them in a minute ago, angled. There's a lot of arguments, and people get quite prissy about the whole business of whether you put them in diagonals or splayed, and people can get quite, oh bugger, there's something I forgot to do. People can get quite over the top about it. And the thing is, really all that matters is that it pulls a certain force, a cumulative force, against the tremolo, so that it works. The force don't really care whether the springs are anchored in a triangle or whether they're some other way. What they care about, all it cares about, is that it's got force pulling. So I think that people kind of argue that the force will be pulling unevenly on all of the different springs. It's not really, that might bother each individual spring, but it doesn't really matter overall to the overall thing. It only matters as far as an individual spring is concerned. Now, the great thing about the Wilkinson bridge is that it only really works well when you adjust this little grub screw. And I'll see if I can zoom in, because Sam, you're going to need to know this, and it's good for Rob to know it as well. I'll see if I can show you where it is. Wow, it's very hard. It's under there. It's dark, so I don't have another phone to make, do I? Hold on, see if I can make extra lights. Sorry about this. Extra lights. Come on, come on, come on. Some light. Oh geez, I'm throwing everything around. I've got two hands tied up in the same job. Ah yeah, there it is, look. Lighting, capillary action. That little grub screw there helps to stiffen up that little arm, and that makes the real difference with the Wilkinson. That makes the Wilkinson tremolo bridge what it is. Now here's the thing. If I just turn the light off and come back to you in a second. Here's the thing. Having tightened it up a bit, you can see now that it's quite stiff, and it'll still come out. You can still pull it out, but this grub screw is keeping it nice and snug. I would rather it that way, so it doesn't have any kind of bounce in the system. Now, the difference between this full strength Wilkinson tremolo and the cheaper one that they've recently introduced, made I think under license for them by one of the Shenzhen factories, branded Music Lily, amongst other things. So they brought out sort of an M series range of products, and they are a sort of more budget version, and actually more, on many of the things they're perfectly fine. They do what you want them to do. The problem I've encountered so far is on the M series version of this bridge, that grub screw on ones I've had before has stripped out immediately. Now I'm not saying it does with all of them. I think Wilkinson are a great company, and I'm not trying to put them down. Just be cautious if you buy the cheaper M series bridge, because this is a game changer for me. This snug plug-in arm with no thread, right? This makes a tremolo that I can use, I would want to use, right? And that grub screw is critical to it, and that will stay there. And there's a tiny bit of movement, but there's no clackety-clack rattle or anything like that. So if you buy one of these and you buy the M series one, you probably pay about £20 for the M series one, and you'll probably pay about £40 for the full strength Wilkinson one. Now, make sure if you find yourself doing the grub screw up to get this nice and stiff the way you want it and with no slop, if you find that grub screw strips, complain back to Wilkinson. Don't settle for it, because this bridge is no good without that. It's no different from any other bridge, really. I mean, yes, it's got a chunkier block, which is great, but generally the thing you will become a convert to, if you're anything like me, is this snug arm, and I love that. So help yourself to buying the full price version at about 40 something quid. And if you buy the 20 quid M series version, it looks identical in every which way. I've got a couple in the cupboard out there, storeroom. Just be cautious, and if you do find that's probably going to be the weak spot, that screw under there, that grub screw. It's stripped on mine, and there was nothing I could do. I can't re-tap it. I can't put a bigger grub screw in. It's suddenly become unserviceable, right? So just keep an eye out for that. But look at that. That's got a nice tremolo arm, and look, it's even genuinely aged cream. Okay, so what we're going to do with this guitar, do you know what? Did we agree fully floating? I should have brought my notes again. I guess for Hendrix only pressed down, if I recall correctly. So we'll start by setting it up down only. So for the time being, we can get rid of the arm. And what I'm going to do, there's another challenge with this guitar. So there is no nut in the world that will fit this, except the one that's on here. So if it's a 7.5, then nobody else makes a 7.5 nut, which is okay. But we can, or have got 7.25 inch radius Tusq nuts, and I've got a set coming tomorrow, which we can use, but right now we don't have one. My plan was originally to repurpose this one, which I'll still try to do, but if not, we'll fit it with a 7.25 one coming tomorrow, because it will make so little difference, it won't be a problem. Now, the first thing I'm going to do with this guitar now, I've sorted out the bridge screws and the tremolo arm snug fit, is I'm going to start by checking out what we've really got. We've got a really high action for starters, which I don't like. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wind these down, because the action is just a mile off where I want it. So that'll be my first sort of gross, inverted commas, variable adjustment. So I start by taking these down, and this one I hope is not, oh god, why do they do this? That one is full of gunk, and it's threatening to strip the adjuster head, you know, the hex key fitting, which is hopeless, not what you want. So you have to be very careful with that. It's okay, but it could be, the reason it's got gunge in it, and it won't let me fit that one in all the way. So I stopped immediately and used a better fitting, slightly newer one, because it's limiting my access to it, which is crap. So I'm going to get me the thingamajig, this thing, and I'm going to dial down the E string until I get where I want to get, which is quite low. Now the other thing I found with this and the other V6, I think, is that actually, and the Made in Mexico, is that the kind of actions that I end up setting for customers, what happens is we end up with the grub screws in the saddle sticking up a mile, so it sort of really makes us wish we had shorter saddle screws. Anyway, I'm going to just, what I'm trying to do at this point is I'm trying to go over all of these and just get them roughly into the zone of action that I want, also bearing in mind that this one has got gunge in it thanks to its fabulous relic'ing process. So I'm taking all these down. I can often do it this way round, which is to sort of eyeball it from above like this. It's quite a good way. It's never perfect, but I'll do the sort of gross movements, as I call it, the large movements. Yeah, it's always a bit of a risk when you sort of gunge up components that are based on screw threads and sockets like these hex sockets. You do run a risk of these things getting clogged, and you don't want that to happen, because ultimately the functionality of the thing has got to be more important than the look. And if there is any risk of sacrificing functionality for the look, then we're definitely in the wrong place. So my concern about this from the outset was that getting this down to the sort of playable action, target action I would like, and sort of ends up leaving us quite low with the saddles, but actually it's not outside the range of adjustability of this set of saddles. We can get there, and it doesn't automatically say, look, you need a shim under here. Now if we struggled to reach the playing action, the desired playing action, then we might be in the sort of place where it says, look, to get there you're going to need to shim this neck, and occasionally that's what you get. Sometimes if you don't have any, if you really hate the spiky saddles and you don't have any shorter ones, which we might look around for and see if we've got, but if you don't, you may find that what you do is actually shim the neck deliberately to give you back some adjustment room. So you shim the neck, raise the neck up, which takes away your playing action, and then in order to gain back your playing action you can raise the saddles, which then embeds them further in. Embeds them further in, and then they don't stick out and hurt you. Ooh, that is one dead string. Okay, so that's now brought this down closer to my target action, but with the strings tightened up, it changes the action quite a bit. So I've still got some height reduction to go here. I can fine tune it and so on. So it's going to be a matter of toing and froing to get down to where I want to end up. Whoops, wrong thing, change. Get down to where I want to end up. And it may be that once I've done that and I check the other end, we may find that the first fret action is too high as well, which needs a bit of gross adjustment. And each time you adjust one thing, the other things lower as well. So we've got to just keep that in mind. So there's my 1.5. So everything needs to go a little lower. Now I've tightened the strings up. And often I can do this now a little bit more by eye, because I can see the way the strings go in relation to each other, and I can get myself a nice sort of spread of strings. Something like that. Right, and then, so I'm just concentrating, as you can see, on the last fret action. Okay, so again, quick double check. We've got 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5. 1.5. 1.3, 1.5. So we're almost out of adjustment on the treble side, but we can get there. And now my only complaint about the action as set on here is just that because of the way the neck is, the action I've set now leaves us with grub screws sticking out. Okay, playable action. The pickups now are too close to the strings by miles, but we want to lower them because we want the playable action first and foremost, and the pickups can follow suit and pick up, follow up. So the rule of pickups, as far as I understand it, and it's first of all, it's important to say it's subjective, so it's however you prefer them to sound. But the rule that I understand is that the closer the pole is to the string, the greater the output, but the less the tonal dynamic. That's what those who are in the know, that's what they say. And the corollary, vice versa, is also the case. So the further away they are, the lower the output, but the greater the tonal dynamic. So it's entirely up to you to find the midpoint for you, or the sweet spot. Now, I've got the bridge, right, one thing about the bridge, it's starting to pull forward a little bit, so I'm going to counter that by adding force to the springs and trying to do it in a way that keeps as much as possible doesn't bash up the ends of the tremolo claw screws, So we want that to stay down. Okay, so now I've got roughly the right action here, or should I say over here. Let's just check how it's looking. Still a little bit high, so I'm still going to take this down a tiny bit just to make sure it's where I really want it. Yep, you're not far off. Let's take it down. So when we're down to where we want it, pretty close, the thing to do, I don't like that grub screw. Now we're going to look at the neck relief. So I'm going to hold down that's what string, the lower E string on the first and the last fret simultaneously, and then halfway along I'm going to check the gap, and there should be a little bit more than absolutely zero gap. So you don't want the string touching the fret, you want it just above it so you can press it down and click. Any more than just being able to see a gap and pressing it down is probably too much. You can get finicky with feeler gauges if you want. I would say aim for at most 0.2 millimeters to start with, which is what I describe as slightly more than no gap. What you don't want is the strings touching the fret, because that's flat, or it could even be backbowed, in which case your notes down here won't play. So we don't want that. So we don't want backbowed, we don't want flat, we want slightly curved away from flat, which means the smallest amount of gap possible. Any more than that, and you can measure it if you like, this is about nearly 1 millimeter, so it's too high. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to adjust the truss rod and dial out this bit of extra relief that we don't want. And to do that, I'm going to use my 4mm hex key, and I'm going to tighten the truss rod to flatten the neck a bit more. Now that was about 1/16 of a turn. I'm going to do 2 in a row. You can't, you can throw your tools on the floor, but you can't damage your truss rod by making those kinds of adjustments. It's a myth that you can, and it's an annoying myth that people should never have tried to frighten you with. What it does is it stops you making necessary adjustments. Now right now that is still not flat enough for my liking. There's still too much relief, so I'm going to add another, this time about 1/6 of a turn, and I'm looking now to get this flatter, and it will probably do that around about now, because I could feel it sort of biting. Right, now we've got the kind of gap I want. And that feels much lower. Now, when I say lower, I don't mean lower in respect of the action at the first fret or the last fret. What I mean by lower is when you flatten your neck out, you have the way if you perceive an action change, you perceive it in the center, because if you think about it, this is now flattening and the gap between the string and the fret is reducing. So when you start fretting up here, you're pushing less distance. Okay, so I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to examine the next third part of that three-part interrelated equation, and that is the first fret action. And this is critical to the guitar playing well as well. If it's too high, your first fret action is more than about 0.3, believe it or not. Up to about 0.5 it'll play okay. Above 0.5 of a mil over the first fret, your notes will start going sharp when you try and play them down there, and that will actually slightly upset open chords. It'll make the fretted notes sound sharper than the open notes, and if you tune the whole thing together, you'll very quickly get into this slightly discordant noise, which if you're quite musical, you'll spot straight away, and you'll hate it because it's discordant, or it'll just hurt your ear. And many people, including myself when I started doing this, you would describe it as not being able to get the guitar into tune, and it's not actually the case. What it is the notes are going sharp because your first fret action is too high. And it just gets worse the higher it is above around 0.5, and I worked out through experience that about 0.3 is a safe place, a conservative place to go. Now, the first thing I can tell you about this nut is that it's slightly high on the first fret. So I'm reading about 0.7 of a millimeter. That's higher than it needs to be. Not only does it make these notes here go sharp, but it also makes it tiring on the hand. It's actually a bit worse on the treble side than it is on the bass side. So really I'd want to adjust this, but I'm going to leave it as it is right this second for now while I do the fret work on this guitar. But I will come back to this, and my first thing will be to remove this nut and potentially turn it into an adjustable nut, as long as it's a Tusq XL. If it isn't, then I will hold out for tomorrow to fit a Tusq XL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically get what I can done. So I'm going to slack off the strings for a minute, and I'm going to move them out the way, leaving the original nut where it is, and I'll try and remove the original nut later on without any damage. If it doesn't come out and I have to cut it out, then we're going to be waiting for the new one anyway. But meanwhile, it's not critical to the leveling, fret leveling part of the game. So I'm going to mark up the frets like so with my marker pen, and I'm going to then get ready to level. Now the whole thing about my leveling method is that first of all, I don't do setups without doing leveling. And the reason for this is quite simple, is that the vast majority of guitars, up in the 90s, high 90s% need leveling if you want to have a low action. And that's because there's nothing particularly unusual about them. It just means that all electric guitars have uneven frets. Unless they've been worked on already and deliberately leveled, then they will have uneven frets. So that's a fact. So the issue is, if I can't, no, to put it another way, with uneven frets, the lowness of the action is dictated by the unevenness of the underlying frets. And we all kind of know that from childhood, because when we had our first guitars, we just got what we were given and we lowered the action as far as it would go if we figured out how to do that. And we lowered it until it ran into buzzing, and then we stopped. And played it, no matter how much it hurt us. Now I do it differently. My setup is about setting the action we want, making the frets work with that. And the reason I do that is because most customers come to me and they want a lower action and one that doesn't buzz and stays in tune. And unless I level the frets, then I can't give them a lower action. Most of the time, most customers, like me and you, have already set the guitar as low as it will play before it buzzes. And so there's no point me getting the same guitar, tweaking away at the saddles, raising them, lowering them, finding the same point of buzzing that they've already found, polishing the fretboard, maybe polishing the frets, restringing it and giving it back to them with a dust over and maybe some, the pickups lowered or raised. That's essentially charging people money for giving them back essentially the same guitar. So I don't do that. What I'll do is I will set the action that I and my customer want, and I will level the frets every time to make them play with that action. And it's the fact that that can be done is something I've learned over the last 8 years, and it's consistent in how I do it, and it works really well. And it means that when I give back a guitar to somebody, I know absolutely that they can tangibly feel the difference in how the guitar plays, and then I know that they're getting a tangible value for their money. I'd hate to be somebody who gives it back having kind of knowing deep down inside that I've really only done mostly what they could do, or what the last tech who tried it could only do without leveling. Because there's no point. It's just taking money to do what you could do at home and get the same result. So I kind of have a thing in my head that I say to myself, if if you can't feel the difference, then I haven't set it up. And if I can't make that difference, then I won't charge you. I won't bother. I'll either not do it or I won't charge you if I can't make a difference. So having tuned this leveling beam that I call, for various historical reasons, I call the banana, I've tuned it to the same shape of relief curve as the neck has, and I use it to level the frets. But the reason I do it with the strings on in this particular weird method is because doing it with the strings on levels the frets with the neck under longitudinal compression. Other methods don't do that, and as a result they level with the neck relaxed and flat, and that's great, except for the fact that the neck changes shape as it bunches slightly under compression once you put the strings back on, which means that the levelness you got when it was off, or the strings were off and the neck was relaxed, is no longer the same as you've got when the strings are under load and the neck is loaded and squished. And I've found over time that that compression changes the way the frets sit, very slightly, but enough to make it worthwhile doing it this way. So the reason I do it this way is that it's, first of all, fractionally, or a little more accurate. I wouldn't say fractionally, it's tangibly more accurate than doing it in the traditional way with the neck off, sorry, the strings off and the neck leveled or flattened on the bench. And the second reason, or probably the main reason actually, that I do it this way is that because the strings are on, I can stop when the action, or when the frets are playing the way I want them to. Now here's an interesting thing we're going to encounter, and this is particular to the 7 point, well, I'm going to call it 7.25, but Vintage calls it 7.5. So 7.5 is a tight radius, and it means that I can get all the notes playing, but it will struggle to bend at the low action across into the G track. So you hear it's choking out across as I bend into G. Now this is a condition. It comes with the 7.25 territory. So that the tighter the radius of a guitar is, the less, higher, if you like, the playing action has to be. Now the reason for that is because when you bend an E string, high E, upwards, away from, this neck feels very flat at the moment, at this point anyway. When you bend a high E across into the G track, on a tight radius, well, on any radius, the E string is actually climbing up a hill. If you look at it as a cross section from the end of the neck, you're pushing upwards up a C-shaped hill, or a hump. But while the middle of the string where you're bending it, or the bend point, is going up this hill, the remainder, or the two ends of the string, are still down at the bottom of the hill in their own track. So the E string is anchored in the E track, and we're bending it out of the E track up into the G, up the top of the hill where the G track lives. And because the anchor points at either end go lower, then it takes away the clearance the string would otherwise have. So what we find is, almost no matter what we do to the fret leveling, on a 7.25 or 7.5 like this, we actually probably can't get, we can't get a 1.2 millimeter last fret action and have the bends work clearly. So what we have to do on the 7.25 is we have to raise this action to a point where we can just get the bends out of it. And you can hear they're coming back, and that is actually pretty, that's pretty good actually. I think we'll go at a remarkable 1.5, which is the same as the bass end of things, which is, if that's what we get away with, that would be quite spectacular. Almost. I mean, it's practically there. Let's leave it there for now. So that means I now know that the concession for my 7.25 or 7.5 inch radius neck that I have going on here has to be in the 1.5 millimeters at the high fret, at the high E and across. We could probably keep it now the same across all the way to the other side of 1.5 mils, but we're not going to get under that without. We can play all the notes, but we won't get the bends working. So I'd rather, obviously I want the bends to be working, and Sam's going to need the bends working as a Hendrix cover, playing a Hendrix cover. So at that point, it's better to have that slightly higher action and have the bends working than to go for a lower action and find it choking out at some point in the mid solo, which is what we don't want. So having raised everything up a little bit, it's still pretty low actually on these bass strings, so I might come up again. Don't like this grub screw that is trying to spin. It almost might be better taking that one out if I can find a spare. That's not a good thing, Vintage, to have naffed up your own working grub screw. Okay. We'll leave it there for now and we'll carry on. Let's just retune. Okay. Always happens when I'm bending strings on a guitar like this. That's okay. Luckily, I've got a spare. Now, I only really need the string on for the time being to load the neck, but it's worth putting another string on to do that. But also, I do want to be able to just check those bends. But that's a typical demonstration of how the 7.5 neck imposes constraints on how low we can have it. And my experience has shown that whereas you can get a 1.2 millimeter playable action of the last fret on a 9.5 inch radius and above, when it comes down to a 7.25 vintage radius, you're going to end up with a 1.5 mils on the treble side at the last fret, which isn't a huge difference. It's only about 1/3 of a millimeter higher, so you'd hardly notice it. You'll still think this is a low playing guitar, but I know that we've had to compromise to sort of overcome the limitations of the geometry, and it is simply that, a geometric limitation of the tightness of the radius. I have got a video on my YouTube thing which does a sort of clever, I think, me doing some clever whiteboard drawing showing pushing bends. I think it's something like leveling frets on tight radii or something like that, if you look for it, if you're interested. But I draw out this three-dimensional challenge that I'm talking about when I'm saying that the geometry of the tight radius imposes that constraint that you can't overcome. And the reason, I think, most importantly, the reason it's important to know that is mainly, or for people who do this kind of thing, who are looking to do this sort of thing, because people can make the mistake of thinking that continual leveling will free up those bends, and it won't. So just being conscious that the tight radius has its limits, which no amount of leveling will overcome. So you don't want to get caught in that situation where you're continuing to level and taking away fret metal for to a place your point you're never going to get to successfully. So I'm going to switch now to I'll go on to the A track and recalibrate for the A and go onwards for there, and then I think I'll comfortably leave it at 1.5 mils, and you know, I've stopped on 2mm before with 7.25 radii in the past. Sometimes I've had to stop there, but this one feels like it's going to work at 1.5, so it's again not far from my target anyway. So with every leveling I check, I'll be checking for the playing of the individual notes. And then I'm checking for the bends. This is a little bit over flat now, so that's partly why it's struggling, because it's leveled itself out. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to do a very small relax there. So you see, I'm a little bit of instinct there told me that it had flattened out. It continued flattening. Now we've got a bit more relief in it. That's good. And we get a tiny bit more space there thanks to that adjustment. So I'm happy with that. I'll keep an eye on it. Some guitars will have a lot of adjustment on the truss rod around a particular point, whereas others will have a more progressive adjustment, and that's probably just mostly down to the wood behaving in different ways. So I'm now going to level the A track, and what I'm kind of looking for at this point is I don't think I've got any. I've checked in playing through this guitar, I don't have any individual obviously high or low frets causing major problems at this point. What I'm hoping for with the A and the E leveling at this point is I want to gently impose an even curve onto the neck at that point so that I can play these notes mostly without any of that So it looks like the A's cleaned up nicely, and now we just need to do the low E, and that's probably going to take a little bit more, because as you get down to the fatter wound strings, they move more and they are more likely to run into the frets as they move. And so at this point the E really wants really benefit from this curve to just impose the curve, this rod to impose the curve onto this fretboard, if you like, and just scoop away where it needs to clear that little bit of extra room for the strings, and that's what this leveling method does quite nicely. So it not only levels or fixes individual high and low frets, but it also gets rid of what I call fret slap, which is the impact of just a slightly wavy fretboard on taking away the clearance we need for the strings. A little bit more on there. Again, you have to, from experience, you have to be aware of what the limits are with clearing up fret slap in terms of the action you've chosen. So if you are on a fairly low action to begin with, and the gauge of strings you have requires a certain amount of movement, and you've got the neck relief set at a certain level, then you'll get to a point where you can't level out any more space that's required, and I'm sort of thinking I'm about there now. Hard to describe exactly why that moment is arrived at, but you sort of know when you're there and you're kind of listening out. Not bad. Hear how it's a little tiny bit, but mostly all gone. So I'm happy with that. I'm not going to push my luck. So we've got the lowest possible action for this radius of the neck. We've got the bridge sorted. I'm going to look out for some replacement grub screws in a minute. But first, while we're here, we've got the next two things to do will be what's the word? Recrowning the frets that we've leveled, followed by polishing and sanding out the frets. Now and at this point in time with the strings off, we'll see if we can remove this nut. A lot of the time, and with lots of different guitars, depending on how the nut's fitted, it's more or less difficult to get out. So on a lot of vintage and Harley Benton 3-a-side headstocks, like the Les Paul Gibson style guitars, the nuts are put on before the finish is applied to the headstocks, and then the nuts are sort of almost glued in place by the finish, which is maybe easier for the production facility, but actually it's terrible for us because it glues the nut in place. And so in order to get the nut out to replace it with a better one, or a Tusq one for example, you are in danger, or the average owner is in great danger of trying to tap it to free it up, and in doing so there's a very great likelihood that because it has been glued in place by the finish, it will lift the finish with it, and often it pulls off a great sheaf of finish off the headstock, which is really ugly. Or if it doesn't do that, it chips the brittle headstock finish and you get great big splintery chips coming out of it. That's a problem with a lot of vintage and current vintage and Harley Benton 3-a-side headstocks guitars. With Strats like this, it tends to be whether or not the nut is really glued in heavily. If it's glued in heavily, it can grip the side of the rosewood fingerboard and pull a chunk of the fingerboard behind the nut off as you try to remove it. And so sometimes, if it feels like it's heavily glued in, then sometimes the only way of removing it can be to saw it out and remove it surgically, which is not most fun, but it's kind of vital to do. So just before I do the the fret crowning, I'm just going to see if this nut wants to play ball and come out under gentle persuasion, or whether it's glued in place. Thankfully that came out in a tidy fashion, and if I'm going to have a close look at it, I think it might actually be the Tusq XL, which is great because what I can do now is I can actually convert this into the adjustable one, which means that we can use it. See, what I didn't want to do, and I don't ever want to do, is I don't want to cut the nut slots down. As I said, for me, the best situation we can have is that we are putting the strings into I call it untrammeled nut slots straight from the factory, so they're smooth and as molded from the factory. Of course, I could just get the nut files and carve downwards into the nut to take each of the strings down to its correct first fret action, because that's not not doing that isn't an option. That's what we have to do to make this guitar play well. It's one of the fundamental things we have to do. So there's no choice in not doing it. However, I would much prefer, and this is my choice these days, is to achieve the correct first fret action by bringing the strings upwards to the correct action, and using an adjustable. Converting this to adjustable, it means I'll be able to do that. So in the meantime, before I get onto that, off camera probably, I'm just going to now do the recrowning part. So having leveled the frets, I'm now going to crown them and polish them out. So I'm using the medium jumbo sized side of the crowning file, and actually not going to really end up having to do too much work on any particular fret, because it just sort of gives you an indication of how little fret metal I've had to take off anyway, which is good. And we just go all the way along and get that fret shape back into a nice D shape, which is its correct original shape. So we're just really rounding off the flat spot that we created in the leveling process. And once I've done all these, the next bit will be to tape off the whole fingerboard and then go through sanding out the frets with a whole suite of sandpapers, which go from 400 grit to 600 to 1000 to 1500, and then swap over to micromesh pads or papers, and go through from 1500 there to 12,000, which is a kind of polishing stage, and that will then have shined everything up, ready to play. So there's a couple of, occasionally when you come across a flat spot, then you have to spend a little bit longer rounding the fret around that flat spot, like that. You can see it doesn't take that long to re-crown. There's a slower method you can do, which I started out doing, which uses a three-sided file, which actually is very satisfying, but it takes about 3 or 4 times longer than this. But then again, you know, when you look at how relatively short this process is, 3 or 4 times longer is not the end of the world. So it's probably a good hand skill to learn if you're doing guitars. Okay. Right, now we have it. Brush off the dust. Okay, so now it's going to be a case of, what was I going to do? And I've done that. I'm going to basically cover this up with low tack tape, a mixture of, and some that I've cut on a board. As the frets get close together, we need different size tape, but I have a sort of routine method that always seems to work out. What I'll do once I've got this taped off, I'll also then turn that nut into an adjustable one. And the nice thing about the adjustable nut is that once we've made it adjustable, it ends up sitting lower than it currently does in the slot. So because the idea is that when it's in the slot with the grub screws fully retracted, I want the nut to have the string sitting on the first fret, and then basically bringing the whole nut up from there. Whole nut? Like I say, it may sound like a lot of work to do, but I genuinely think that one of the secrets of the good tuning stability that I get is using the factory slots and not cutting into them. It just seems to me, if you can, why wouldn't you use those instead of using the files? Because the files, no matter how expensive they are at a microscopic level, they're pretty ragged, and you sort of hack away at the slots until you get to the right action. And it works fine, but I am always sort of chasing as near perfection as I can get. So I've become a convert to the Wilkinson push-in tremolo, providing it's the full fat version and not the or providing it doesn't strip the screw and the arm stiffening screw. But I'm also a convert to the adjustable Tusq nut for the best of tuning possible, because I said it on so many videos, but I'll say it again. It wasn't long, I didn't have to be doing this for many years before I realized that the thing I cared most about with any guitars, having got several hanging up, I realized the ones that I picked up straight away off the peg, and then what mattered to me most in any guitar at this point in my life was that it plays and stays in tune. And it was a funny realization because, of course, as kids, we were almost obsessed by everything in the exact opposite priority. So I kind of wrote down the priorities for me nowadays, and that is, one, above all else, that it plays in tune. So even though I think playability, the action, is a close second, a really good low light action that doesn't play sharp at the nut and doesn't have any bends and chokes, I think that's critically important. It's still number two, because there's no point having that if the guitar won't stay in tune. So the priority order is, without a doubt, the staying in tune, staying and playing in tune. The second was the playability, that so long as it stays in tune, then what I care most about is that it's low and light and doesn't buzz and doesn't choke. Actually, then after that, I will sort of get more interested in the pickups and the tone it makes, partly because I know that the tone has a lot to do with A, how I play, B, my amp, C, my pickups, D, how I feel that day, and a whole bunch of other strange little variables that aren't necessarily strictly to do with the guitar. So that's down the list. And then later on, how it looked. So probably number 4, how it looks. And then probably 5 out of 5, the least important thing as a more mature player, least important of all, ends up being the brand on the headstock or whatever. And actually I realized that it didn't matter to me hardly at all, which I thought was quite funny. So yeah, there was a point in time doing this work that I realized that, in fact, that list that I've just kind of run through there, that is my current priorities, is amusingly probably the exact opposite of what I cared about, or we cared about as kids. So running it backwards, remember as kids how we were just completely obsessed with the brands. It's a Gibson, it's a Fender, and we knew it all, and we studied the specs and the books, and and we believed that if you got a Fender, you would suddenly somehow play brilliantly, because that's what happened. And of course, it didn't happen that way, but if you weren't brilliant, you weren't brilliant with a Fender. And the other important thing is you didn't necessarily even get a well-playing guitar or good action when you had a Fender. That was the other myth. But so the thing we cared about was the brand. Well, we were full of dreams that if we got one of these, all our troubles would be solved and we'd play like gods. The second most important thing was probably how it looked, again, which is the number 4 in my list of important things, i.e. not important at all. But to us it mattered. The look of the guitar was all important, or very high on the list. Then after that was the name of the no, we said the name, the brand. Yeah, then the look of it, then the pickups, and then sort of the playability, and last of all was the whether or not it stayed in tune, or probably followed closely by whether did it stay in tune or not. And the fact that that was so low on our priority list is kind of shown by the fact that almost none of us had a guitar that stayed in tune, so it couldn't have been important enough, because the manufacturers didn't care enough and we didn't care enough. So it was just literally the back to front of everything that seemed to matter, and I just thought that was quite funny. Made me kind of laugh a bit, but it'll explain to anybody why I do what I do, because, and hence the attachment to using Tusq at all times now, and my obsession with stretching strings and so on. So it's all about the first priority. The guitar I'll take off the shelf faster than anything else off the peg is the one that is always in tune when I pick it up, and that's why I put all the effort into the nut, the quality of the nut, the quality of the slots, and the stretching of the strings. So kind of self-explanatory, or explains a lot about me. When you know that those are my priorities, you understand why I do that in the setups that I do. So right now I'm just going to take off, refit this Strat button, which feels a bit loose, but I'm going to put a new felt behind it, because if it had one before, it's made it completely flat. Yeah, there is one there, but it is totally flattened. I think this should do up tightly still, but it had just come adrift. So we'll update it and refresh it while we're here. Now, the issue is, will it stay? Sometimes it's difficult because you don't quite get a long enough screw. I think that's okay. It's in place. That one's all right. Right, so yeah, that's my obsession. Is it's all about tuning stability first, followed by playability, and it's also why, if somebody says, "What if I had, I don't know, if I had 40 quid to invest in my guitar to make it play better, what would you recommend?" And my answer would always be, spend it on your nut. In other words, get the nut sorted out, and that would be my recommendation. Followed by get the frets leveled and get the action right. But the nut, it would be the first port of call. So I'm just going to start the process of converting this nut. If it hadn't have been a Tusq XL already with the Teflon in it, I would have not bothered, but it is already that nut. So on that basis, I'm going to start by getting it ready for adjustability. And that means making 2 starter screws, holes, pilot holes for the grub screws, and I do them in a way that I can drill now in a minute down into them. So I'm just clearing a little burr there, and once I've done the holes, which I'll go across and do on the drill now, which is set up for doing exactly this. I'll probably show you at a distance. Exciting shot. Not. It will get noisy in a minute, but as I drill, once I've drilled these holes, then I will end up sanding this nut down quite a lot, probably losing the little foot part that we've currently got, because it isn't necessary for the raising it up as an adjustable nut, but we'll come to that in a minute. So let me just get going. One. All good. Two. Adjustable nuts. Boom, boom. Back down. Camera view. Keep you in focus. So, what we're going to do, oh God, I'm going to have to order more of these soon. The rate that I go through these things, well, it's good news. I mean, it shows I'm doing pretty good business, but I should go through my supplies. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up from underneath these, and I'm going to tap a thread into them. Thankfully, I already know the gauge and pitch and everything of the thread that I need. So I just have to get on and do it. Now I've tried doing this, tapping holes and stuff in lots of different materials, and I can tell you that it just doesn't work in bone. Occasionally it will. You'll get it to work once in a while, and I've got a couple of examples where it does, and most of the time it won't work in bone, and it's likely to split. This one's actually this one feels a little different to normal. I think it's an XL, isn't it? Yeah, it says XL. And my eyes are not quite as accurate as they would once have been. Yeah, so I've tried it on different materials, and bone, it will do it once in a while, but it runs the risk of, even at a later date, it tends to sometimes split, and also it's likely to collapse as well under load. And the great thing I found about Tusq is because it's this consistent material, it doesn't have any sort of layers and sediments, or yeah, you know what I mean. And it's consistent all the way through, so that when you do cut into it, the material either side of where you're cutting is strong enough to support the cut and the grub screws and so on, and it works really well. But that's just from trial and error, and I have a couple of guitars that, obviously I've not been doing this for decades, but I've got a couple of guitars at home that have been fully strung and played intermittently off and on now for several years, and they are working perfectly well, and there's no sinking, folding up of the material. There's no, in fact, there's not even any compression of the wood where the grub screws stand. So everything's working just as it did. The only thing occasionally you might find, I found occasionally, is there's a bit of immediate compression as you first put in put the nut under load, but actually it's turned out it always worked out fine. So I'm just going to come on, fit in the end. So what I'm going to ultimately do is I'm going to just leave that there for now. We're probably going to end up sanding it down first to the right height, and then I'm going to, once I've got it to the right height, then we'll get the grub screws to the right length, which they don't have to be very long at all, and then trim those, and I'll sand those flat at the bottom so that their little feet don't stick into anything. This one's actually quite strangely snug. It's not a bad thing, it's better than being loose. Right, I'll leave that there for a minute. So there's my nearly ready to go adjustable, soon to be adjustable nut with the little hex grub screw that goes with it. In fact, what I'll do is I'll do that now before I do all the sanding thing. Since I've got the guitar sort of ready, I just need to take off one of the pieces of masking tape. So, there we are. So, let's take off this piece of masking tape. And we can work on that. So, right there, we know that fits in nicely there, and we need to bring this down. Now what I will notice about this particular one, and I could see it before, is it is somebody's cut this nut slot a bit larger than it ought to be, which is probably not the end of the world, but it's not ideal. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sanding this down. And see where it's cutting and see what angle it's doing it at. And if it's wandering a bit, just straighten it up. And if it's also now starting to flatten the grub screws, that's also not a problem. That's straighter, and then we check it out in the slot. Now this is a little bit difficult to gauge without the strings, but I can usually tell fairly well if I put the blade in there, and we're not far off the height we need to be at. So I'm going to now concentrate on doing it on the finer sandpaper. Okay, so the screws are flat, which is not, well, not what I wanted actually, idiot. Gone ahead and forgotten what I was doing. Now this is interesting because that's like sitting on that seems like it's sitting on a little ledge, and I think, I'm feeling it's something to do with that that slot having been cut. I don't know if it's got a dip in it or something's not right in there. Now what I've just done is I've just made flat things. I needed the points to begin with, but never mind. It's not the end of the world. Let's have a look. Let's just do a little bit more flattening for a minute. You may still be able to use the grub screws to mark up where we want to be. So that's nearly flat, and that's about as tall as it needs to stand. Then we have that with the, if I put the blade in here, that is going to be a fraction more off, and we're nearly going to be flat strings on the first fret when we start off, but better that they're more on the first fret than less, if you get what I mean. So just looking at the shape of the nut, that's okay, that's okay. I think I think what there is there's a little ditch in this, a little hollow or a dent in this slot, but it's also wider on this vintage than ideally we'd want it. But if we're standing up on our little grub screws, we should be all right. Now, what I'm probably going to do, in fact what I will do, to do this right, I'm going to get 2 more grub screws with the points, and I'm going to dial out these flattened ones because they're really now going to just be in the way, and I'm going to push them through the threaded body of the nut. Now at the other side, and I'll probably just end up pulling them off and throwing them away. So again, push this one through. So using the pointed ones was the idea in the first place, because what I can do is I can use them to mark where the feet should stand, and then what I'll do is I'll make a couple of little dents in the rosewood of the nut slot, and that will house these feet so that the nut won't go side to side at any point. It's pretty handy that it does that. And so the first thing I'll do is to push this through, and we'll just get about 1 millimetre of the pointy bit sticking out the underside, and we'll do the same with the other. And then once we've got those in place, it's nice and firm the way these have gone in. Okay, there's a little millimetre of point out the other side. So then I'm going to do this, put that there, going to put that in the slot like that, line it up. It's standing quite tall on its little feet at the moment. Let's just line it up so it's in the right place first. I call that the right place. Then I make a couple of impressions, which I can see right there, and I will find a couple of sort of bluntish drill bits for this purpose, and then I'm going to start with, actually this one's about the right size, nearly as wide as the nut slot, and I'm just going to drill down with my fingertip pressure on the impression that I've made, which is dead center on the slot, or dead center where the grub screw will sit. And the idea now is that they've got to be roughly about the same depth, and that's just an eyeball thing. And the idea now is that when I pull the, now I've lost it, oh, here it is, when I get these through, they will sit in, or they will locate in those little dents. Now before I do that, I'm going to take this right down to about 1 millimeter sticking out only, because that's about the only amount I want to raise up, so I only need that amount of adjustment. Then I'm going to cut the excess off with my flush cutty things like that from underneath, and once I've done that, I'm going to use the sandpaper here just to flatten the feet of those grub screws again, which I did the first time, but I did it too soon. So once I've got me these flat little feet like that, now I'm going to bring them out a tiny fraction, about half a fraction of a mil, just enough to hopefully locate in the little recess. And we go in here like that, and then that won't go sideways. Look at that. So that's my adjustable nut ready to go. Now whether this is, if this is too high, all told, by the time we've put the, it may still be too high, I will then come back and we'll sand this back a little bit later. But right now, that's all in order, and everything is kind of ready to go. So now it's time for me to go off camera for a minute, do the polish everything out business, and come back to you with ready to go with new strings on, but then I can do the final height adjustment on the nut and we'll be ready to go. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry, I gave you a warning. See you in a minute. Okay, we're back to string up the guitar. Oh, I think I'll do also, I need to put a bit of oil on the fingerboard. First, just been listening to a couple of bloggers whose commentary, or whose commentary maybe, whose analysis on Ukraine situation is very interesting, or very informative. There's one I've listened to, I think I've mentioned it already, but a guy called Vlad Drexler, oh my goodness, sorry, I've got his name wrong. Anyway, he did a really interesting analysis the other day of 3 main options that Putin has at this point in time, because there was, at the time that post came out, there was a lot of talk about, a lot of people were talking about what Putin was going to say on today's parade in Moscow, and as it turns out, he appears to have said very little other than the garbage that you would expect, which is, we're fighting against a war against NATO and the evil project of Nazism, of whatever. But just more of the same story. But the Vlad Drexler's, oh god, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. His analysis showing realistically what 3 things. Well, he said there were 3 options that Putin had, and he put them in a kind of chart, a column, and addressed each one individually to look at its merits. And the first one was to accept defeat. I thought it was interesting. The second one was to mobilize, and the third one was to, I think it was to escalate. And so starting with, what he did was he kind of looked at each one of these from the point of view of which paid off Putin best or worst. And I think part of the assessment was you had to kind of, we began with an understanding or an agreement that what Putin's most concerned about is his own retention of power, therefore obviously survival, but survival and retention of power. And so providing we could agree that as a start point. So we looked at the idea of, let's start with the ones that he couldn't do. So we looked at the idea of mobilization, and straight away it appeared that mobilization was an impossible one, because it would basically risk his hold on power far too much, because mobilization would get the whole of Russian population basically asking, you know, what's going on, why are our sons disappearing and not coming back, and so on and so forth. So putting out, demanding or imposing a draft would destabilize his control of Russia too quickly and create too much opposition, especially in the absence of having any credible victories to kind of talk about or to show evidence of. So that was really interesting, that probably wouldn't work, or that would be too great a threat. So they looked at the idea of what's the word? Oh God, I've forgotten. I keep forgetting this word. It's really weird. The word where you escalate. That's right, escalation. And so they kind of figured out that escalation, when you have, I can't remember that. I'm misrepresenting this analysis very badly. But escalation, when you've spent sort of 3/8 of your entire military hardware and so on and so forth, was a really bad strategy, and in the short term it would not achieve anything. It was, I think it was on the basis that Putin could declare himself, Russia as against the whole of NATO, and it being World War III, and we're really already in it. And then the other one was, I think it was interesting because it's counterintuitive. So the one that actually worked out as more likely than any of them was accepting defeat. And so, you kind of looked at that and you thought, he's never going to do that. Well, the truth is, he's never going to do that in the eyes of his people. But actually, given that he doesn't care what we know, in other words, we can know that they've lost in Ukraine badly, but he still has, providing he keeps the propaganda and the civilian control, the civic control over his people, punitive control, then actually you can turn what he and we know as defeat into success, because you can still say, well, we got rid of the Nazi Azov brigade. We've destroyed Mariupol, which was where they were based. So we've denazified that steelworks and that city because we've got rid of it. We've gained some more of those territories that we said we were going to save, and we've done that. And of course, that would still settle into a long-term sort of stalemate, which everyone kind of expects it to anyway. But from his point of view, it's almost easier to do that than to do nothing else, because it's clear that the Russian population seem to be comfortable with that as far as they can be. So in other words, a kind of simple way around it is probably saying, do the thing that's least radical, whilst carrying on doing what you're best at, which is telling your people a whole load of lies that they're happy to believe. And actually, when you sort of look at it that way, it does make a lot of sense. especially that thing of, you know, we sometimes get mistaken with, you know, what we know isn't credible, and then we go, but that isn't credible. But then you have to, if you remember that this is a country where people are used to being fed one version and one version of things only, and that a dissent is still outlawed, or increasingly now more, but it always was, then actually you've got to remember that all Putin cares about is what his people think he's doing, not what we think he's doing. He actually doesn't care that we know he's peddling a load of propagandist lies. He doesn't care that we know that at all. He knows that we know that. It only matters to him that his people believe or go along with what he's saying. So he doesn't care what they think in one sense, but he cares only what they think from a point of view of it only matters what they think. His ability to retain power is only related to what they think, not what we in the West think. So if we're, as long as they're kept away, a bit like North Korea, things that look ridiculous to us work in their context. And if we can get off our sort of high horses and keep in mind that he doesn't care what we think, the fact that we know, we can see right through every bit of his propaganda is totally immaterial. It has no interest to him, because we have no bearing on his grasp on power. Or we have no kind of significant, it doesn't really matter. We don't dictate, we don't shape his degree of his grasp on power. His people and what they will tolerate and believe do. And I just think that's quite an amazing thing. I may have extrapolated a ton of that from what Vlad didn't say, but so my impression of this guitar is it's got a very shallow nut slot, and the nut slot is slightly too wide for the type of nut that's been put in here. So it's working, but it's working. That's all I can say about it. In my world, my ideal world, I would prefer that the nut slot was deeper, but I'm not about to carve it deeper to make it my preferred way. But what we have is put the thing down here, in we go with the tremolo arm. And there we have it. Now, I suppose what I ought to do is play a bit. I think I've got a couple more of these nuts coming tomorrow, and I'm wondering whether I shall replace this with a white one tomorrow. I think I might just do that. I was hoping to give this back, but I think I'd be happier to replace this one. I think the nut slot on this is actually just a fraction too high it will only really take a what do you call it, a fixed nut, but that means I'll have to just cut it from scratch. And what I don't know actually is whether, even with that, whether it's already been worked too wide, or whether the what do you call it, the vintage nut is too wide. They are on a lot of other vintages, so it may be just the sort of typical problem, in which case so it would be that somebody has taken the original nut that came with this guitar and potentially changed it out for a slightly too loose, what do you call it, that thing, slightly too loose Tusq one, and it may be that the only real way of getting a nut to fit this that isn't its original one might be to cut one from a block, which I'm sort of loath to do, because I don't like, as I said, for all the reasons I don't like cutting into the material. But the alternative way is we get another one and we just slightly widen the nut with a sort of booster, some booster material. Let me just turn this out. Well, you know, we shall see. So I'm starting out now with the volume full up all the time. It's my new de facto way of starting. Two seconds. Oh. screws in a bit more at the back. Listening to that the other day on YouTube. How come these are so loud? Sorry. So I haven't stretched the strings or any such thing, but so I'm gonna have a look tomorrow at another nut for this, only because I just think this slot is a bit too wide and a bit too narrow for the Tusq replacement nuts. So I think I'll just yeah, I'll come back up to this tomorrow with the replacement nuts in hand, and I'll drop Rob a message, because I think it's playing fine. I just think that's a little bit too, yeah, you know, it works. It's just the Vintage always do this. They've always done this thing with these weird nuts that are non-standard. On some of their old Encores and things, they're just so non-standard that there is nothing that will fit them. Particularly their Indian Encores, they just don't work with any other known thing. So I'll think I'm going to make a decision tomorrow. I'll either remake it with a new one and use a deeper cut, a slightly deeper, work a slightly deeper slot, so that it can do its job without leaning the way it's doing. It's not helped by the fact that it's a little bit too wide, this slot, and I may have to use a bit of spare Tusq material, which I've got a spare. I mean, I could potentially put a little bit on the front of this to keep it standing up straight anyway, which may be one option to do, but that's going to take cutting this down. I mean, the actual amount of material that I'd have to put on there would be tiny, and it really wouldn't benefit from this unless it's actually deeper in the slot. So I think that's a double-edged thing that I've got to take care of. I thought I'd finish, but that's Vintage for you. What it shows me is that some previous owner has removed the original nut, because the original nut is fitted exactly for their slightly wider than normal slot. And as I say, I could use something here. What have I got? I've got some blanks here hidden away somewhere. I could use, well, I say I could, but it might actually be too narrow. Yeah, that actually may be too narrow. I've got blanks that could just be Yep, fractionally too narrow. So even cutting one from scratch out of there would not be perfect for this. So a better option, and I have various bits of Tusq available to me that we can use. And I think actually here's one that's probably wide enough for that. However, I think we have to make it either a fixed nut or go lower. So my feeling tomorrow is to put in a fixed nut on this, just cut it to exactly the right height, and then go with that. But I can't do it until it arrives tomorrow. So that's it for now. I'll get off and we'll be done and dusted. Call it done because I probably won't film the next bit. But you know, it's all there except for changing it over. It's going to end up being a white one, but that fits with the rest of the guitar anyway. So, heh heh. All right, thanks for watching. See you soon.